Story 1. In October 2022, police rushed to the home of Pastor Denzel Williams, a beloved church leader known for his charisma and see. But this time, it wasn't about ministry. Denzel was found murdered. Once a respected figure with a bright future, he now lay dead in his own home. Who killed him? And why? Behind the faith and fame was a story of betrayal, secrets, and deadly consequences. Denzel Williams was more than just a pastor. He was a visionary, a man who captivated a room with his energy and words. His ministry at Mount Zion Baptist Church was the cornerstone of his life and the life of his community. Charlotte, North Carolina, with a population of over 800,000, was a city known for its diversity and growth. At the heart of that bustling city, Mount Zion Baptist became a pillar of hope, and Denzel was its leading force. The church had a growing congregation, and Denzel's sermons resonated not only within its walls, but throughout the city. His words carried weight, his presence magnetic. Under Denzel's leadership, Mount Zion evolved into a hub of community life. From youth ministries to programs for underprivileged families, his work extended far beyond Sunday services. He was regularly invited to speak at conferences, recognized by church leaders and civic groups alike. He often referred to himself as a servant rather than a leader, a man committed to the needs of the people. The church wasn't founded by him, but since being appointed lead pastor in 2001, the ministry had expanded in ways few had anticipated. Denzel's journey to this place wasn't easy. He didn't come from a pastoral lineage. His parents were hard-working people, but had little involvement in church life. In his early 20s, after attending a late-night prayer meeting in a small Charlotte church, Denzel felt something shift. He called it a moment of divine clarity. That night, he told his pastor he wanted to serve, not just preach, but serve with purpose. But preaching alone wouldn't build the vision he saw. It would take structure, time, and sacrifice. That's when Latasha came in. Latasha and Denzel met in their early 20s. She was a college graduate, passionate about social justice and nonprofit work. He was a driven young minister with a calling, but no congregation. They met at a volunteer event and quickly discovered shared values, faith, community, and service. Latasha, drawn to Denzel's sincerity and purpose, eventually said yes to both his love and his vision. From the beginning, Latasha's life was one of sacrifice. She had once dreamed of running her own nonprofit, but as Denzel stepped into ministry leadership, she quietly stepped into support mode. She helped organize events, handle logistics, balance budgets, and coordinate outreach, all while working a full-time job. The church gave them a modest home to live in and a few allowances, including transportation support and health coverage, but the financial cushion wasn't always enough. Despite his growing popularity, Denzel's church salary sometimes couldn't cover all their household needs. His speaking engagements rarely came with honorariums. The church covered what it could, but Latasha often had to use her own paycheck to keep their home running, paying for groceries, utilities, and sometimes even church-related expenses when budgets were tight. Still, she never complained. She believed in the mission. While other pastors might have climbed into wealth and excess, Denzel chose modesty. He poured resources into church programs, not personal luxuries, and Latasha respected him for it, even when it meant bearing the weight of their home life alone. As the church grew, so did its demands. By 2012, Mount Zion had moved to a larger facility with over 2,000 members. By 2020, that number crossed 5,000. Denzel was traveling for more conferences, prayer retreats, charity partnerships, while Latasha was left to hold things down at home and still report to her 9-to-5. The emotional toll grew alongside the ministry. The man who once couldn't wait to get home now spent more time in hotel rooms and board meetings. Their conversations turned into logistical check-ins. Date nights were postponed or skipped altogether. And though Latasha was proud of what they built, she missed her husband, the man she met in a crowded community hall all those years ago. The church applauded Denzel's sacrifice, but no one saw Latasha's. She had traded her youth, career, and emotional stability for a mission that seemed to keep pulling her husband further away. And while their life looked steady from the outside with a church home, reliable transportation, a faithful congregation, there were moments at the end of each month when Latasha quietly transferred money to cover bills. The church stipend didn't stretch to meet. She never let on, not to the members, not to the board, not even to Denzel. But the weight was building, and no amount of faith could stop what was starting to unravel behind closed doors. The truth was, Denzel's life wasn't as perfect as it looked on the outside. By 2014, he was in his early 50s. Mount Zion Baptist Church was growing fast, and Denzel was now a well-known figure in Charlotte. To the public, he was a committed husband and a spiritual leader. But away from the pulpit, away from the eyes of his congregation, Denzel was hiding something. He had started taking more out-of-town engagements, weekend prayer retreats, pastoral training seminars, leadership workshops. That was the story. That was what he told Latasha. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? She had been by his side from the beginning. But the truth was, some of those trips had nothing to do with ministry. It was one of those weekends in Atlanta that Denzel first met Crystal Green. She worked at a club on the edge of town. The lights were low, the music was loud, and Denzel had just finished a church seminar hours earlier. He walked into that place thinking he would stay for a moment. He stayed for hours. Crystal was in her late 20s. She was bold, magnetic, and full of confidence. Denzel was drawn to her energy. It was different from what he felt at home. There were no expectations, no board meetings, no sermons to prepare. Just silence. Escape. They talked more than expected that night. About life. About stress. About things Denzel hadn't said out loud in years. And by the end of the evening, something had shifted. What started as conversation turned into messages. Then came phone calls, then meetings. And within weeks, Denzel was planning his trips around her. Latasha had no idea. She trusted him. Completely. For years she had handled their home. She was still working full-time and still managing the church operations. Denzel had more space than ever to move without question. He would kiss her goodbye before leaving for revival weekend, then text Crystal once he was back on the road. The affair lasted over a year. Crystal, despite knowing Denzel was married, leaned into the connection. He told her she made him feel alive again. He said things at home had grown cold. She listened. She entertained the fantasy. But it was never just about romance. For Denzel, Crystal was freedom. In a life where every move was watched and every word was weighed, she was the one place he felt he could let go. Back in Charlotte, Latasha continued to carry the weight of the church and their home. She kept the books. She stayed late after Sunday service to count offerings and close the church. She made sure the lights were on and the volunteers were fed. If she felt tired, she kept it to herself. If she noticed Denzel becoming distant, she told herself it was the ministry. She believed the stress was temporary. Denzel was slipping away, and she didn't see it. The affair wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, hidden in hotel rooms and parking lots. It lived in Denzel's phone under coded names. It lived in receipts he threw away before getting home. But every secret has a cost. On June 5, 2017, everything changed. That evening, Denzel was not at a prayer retreat. He was not counseling a family or preparing a sermon. He was with Crystal. The two had checked into a small hotel off the interstate, away from the city and anyone who might recognize him. As night fell, Denzel drove her back through the quiet roads of South Carolina. His hands on the wheel, his thoughts scattered. The guilt was there. So was the thrill. It was a storm inside him that he never said out loud. The highway was dark. Denzel pushed the car faster. Maybe he was trying to outrun the weight of what he had become. Maybe he was just tired. Just before midnight, as the car curved around a bend, he missed the shoulder. The tires screeched, and within seconds, the vehicle spun off the road and slammed into a tree. The impact crushed the front end and shattered the windshield. Crystal survived. Her injuries were minimal. A fractured wrist. A few bruises. She crawled out of the wreckage, dazed and in shock, and called for help. Denzel, still in the driver's seat, was unconscious. Blood covered his shirt. He was barely breathing when the paramedics arrived. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly. He had suffered major head trauma. A portion of his skull had fractured. There was swelling in the brain, internal bleeding, and a long list of complications. By morning, he was in a coma. Machines kept his body stable, but his mind was gone. Latasha got the call just after 3 a.m. She had been asleep. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. They told her there had been an accident. Her husband was in critical condition. She didn't ask any questions. She grabbed her keys and drove straight to the hospital. When she arrived, she found him surrounded by tubes, wires, and machines. His face was swollen. His body was still. She stood by the bed and waited. She asked the doctors if he would wake up. They said it was too early to know. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Denzel remained unconscious. The swelling in his brain subsided, but his cognitive functions were uncertain. Doctors could not promise recovery. He was breathing on his own, but he could not speak. He could not move. Latasha made a decision. She would not leave. She quit her job within the week. She moved into temporary housing near the hospital. She used her savings to cover what the church insurance did not. She cashed out retirement funds. She sold their house. She begged the board at Mount Zion to keep Denzel's name on the payroll so that the medical coverage could continue. They agreed. But the support was limited. The rest was on her. Every morning, she sat by his side. She read him scripture. She played his favorite gospel music. She held his hand through the night. When doctors said progress was slow, she asked what more she could do. When nurses said he was not responding, she still hoped. For 4 years, she lived in that hospital rotation. There were birthdays she spent alone, anniversaries that passed quietly, friends who stopped checking in, bills that went unpaid. But she stayed. Denzel's name remained on the church sign. The congregation prayed for him each Sunday. But behind closed doors, it was Latasha who did the work. And through all of it, no one asked why he was on that road. No one asked who the woman in the passenger seat was. The details of the crash were sealed in silence. But time has a way of pushing truth to the surface. For years passed. Then came the first blink, the twitch of a hand, a whisper of recognition. Slowly, Denzel began to come back. But he was not the man he had been. His speech was broken, his memory inconsistent. He struggled to form complete thoughts. The doctors called it progress. Latasha called it a miracle. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. She wondered what memories still lived inside him. And what would happen when those memories returned? Would he remember the pain he caused? Would he remember her sacrifices? Would he feel regret? Or would he wake up and still be holding on to someone else? The wait was over. By the end of the 4th year, nothing much had changed. Denzel remained silent, locked inside a broken body. He needed help with everything, breathing, moving, eating. The machines kept his lungs working. The nurses turned him every few hours to keep his body from weakening further. Each time the monitors beeped, Latasha looked up. She prayed for movement, a sound, anything. She never left his side. She continued her routine for him despite his early recovery signs. Every morning, Latasha continued to arrive before the first shift change. She brought clean towels, fresh socks, and whatever scripture passage she had read the night before. She would hold his hand and talk to him as if he could answer. She told him about the weather, about what was happening at church. She reminded him who she was. She reminded him who he was. The nurses knew her by name. They kept a chair ready by the window. Some of them watched in silence, touched by the way she carried herself. Others said nothing, used to families who stayed only a few weeks before disappearing. But Latasha never disappeared. She made sure every appointment was kept. She sat through hours of silence. She believed. By early 2021, Denzel opened his eyes more often. He tracked movement. He blinked on command. There were days he would squeeze her fingers, and days he could not. He had to relearn how to swallow, how to lift his arm, how to speak. Every win was a battle. Every step forward was met with 2 steps back. His mind was healing, but not always in the way she hoped. At first, he could not remember much. Then memories came in fragments. He remembered old sermons, a youth outreach trip, a choir rehearsal. But not always Latasha. Sometimes he looked at her as if she were a kind stranger. Those moments hurt. Still, she stayed. The hospital assigned him a new nurse in early 2021. Her name was Diana Richards. She was young, early 30s, soft voice, a quiet strength in the way she moved through the room. She had experience with brain injury patients, and she was patient. She never raised her voice. She spoke to Denzel like he could understand every word, and he responded to her. More than once Latasha watched his eyes follow Diana as she walked around the room. She noticed the way he smiled at her, the way his fingers reached for hers. At first, she told herself it was confusion. Brain trauma could do that. People mistook nurses for relatives all the time. That is what she told herself. But it kept happening. One afternoon, in mid-2021, Latasha returned from a meeting with the billing office. She had been gone less than an hour. When she opened the door to Denzel's room, she froze. Diana was sitting beside him. Their hands were intertwined. Denzel was looking at her in a way Latasha had not seen in years. He reached up and touched her face. Then he kissed her. It was brief, gentle, but it happened. Neither of them saw Latasha standing in the doorway. She turned around and walked out. She said nothing. That night, she did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling in her small apartment and tried to understand what had just happened. After everything, after all the years, after every sacrifice, he had found someone else. Again, and he was still in a hospital bed. Latasha returned the next morning. She brought breakfast for the nurses. She smiled. She kissed Denzel on the forehead. She acted like nothing had happened. But something inside her had shifted. She was still there, but part of her had begun to leave. She kept caring for him. She kept showing up. But in the quiet moments, she stopped praying aloud. She stopped reading scripture at his bedside. She started watching him more than she spoke to him. She wondered who he was becoming. And she wondered how long she could stay. Latasha had always taken care of herself. She ate clean, kept her doctor appointments, and rarely missed a day of work unless it was absolutely necessary. She had always been the dependable one, the steady one. Through everything, she had remained strong. But by early 2022, something had changed. She was tired all the time. Her body ached in ways that did not feel normal. Small sores appeared around her mouth and would not heal. Her energy, once constant, seemed to drain without warning. She thought maybe it was stress. She had been carrying too much for too long. The hospital visits, the late nights, the weight of loving someone who had once been everything and was now someone else entirely. But this was different. On March 12th, she sat in a small white room at her doctor's office. The walls were quiet. The lights felt too bright. Her physician, a woman she had seen for years, sat across from her with a file in her hands. The pause was longer than it should have been. Then the words came. Clear. Cold. Final. The tests were positive. Latasha had contracted both HIV and herpes. She did not speak. She stared at the woman across from her and waited for some other sentence. Something to explain how this could have happened. But there was nothing else. Latasha sat in silence. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Her breath felt heavy. The words spun in her mind but landed nowhere. She drove home without remembering the road. At the kitchen table, she sat with the results in her hand. The paper felt heavier than it should. The numbers stared back at her. The proof was there. She called the hospital and asked for a private meeting with Denzel's primary physician. She told them she needed to know everything. That is when she learned the second blow. Denzel had tested positive months ago. It had been part of a routine screening after he began regaining more function. The results had been placed in his file. He had been told. He understood. But he had never said anything. He never told her. She had cared for him. She had fed him. She had kissed him. She had shared a bed with him the night he returned home for weekend care. And he had said nothing. Latasha sat alone in their living room that night. The walls felt too quiet. Her phone buzzed once with a message from the hospital. She did not open it. She thought about everything she had given. Every sleepless night. Every bill she had paid. Every prayer she had spoken over a man who knew he was killing her from the inside. The betrayal was no longer just emotional. It was now in her blood. In her body. A permanent mark left by a man she had fought for when he could not even speak. The questions came slowly at first. Why didn't he tell her? When did he find out? And what was she supposed to do now? She sat in the dark, her hands shaking. She wanted to scream. But no sound came out. This was more than betrayal. It was destruction. And it had come from the one person she had believed would never hurt her. Latasha sat in silence for 3 days. She did not answer calls. She did not return to the hospital. She did not tell a soul. In those hours she went through every memory. Every moment she had given to a man who left her broken. She thought of their first church service together. She thought of the nights she spent alone while he traveled. She thought of the moment she stood in a doctor's office and heard the words that changed everything. She had given her life to him, her youth, her trust, her body. And now, her body carried diseases she did not ask for. The man she nursed back from the edge had never once told her the truth. She had stood beside him while he lay unconscious. She had prayed for his healing. And when he awoke, he gave himself to someone else. Then he took what little she had left. The anger was not loud. It was quiet, slow, cold. She did not scream. She did not cry. She planned. On the morning of March 20th, 2022, Latasha left work early. She stopped at the grocery store. She picked up oxtail, rice, Scotch bonnet, and thyme. She bought a bottle of red wine. She chose the one he used to like. She went home and began to cook. She cleaned the living room. She set the table with care. 2 plates, cloth napkins, candles. She opened the windows just enough to let in the breeze. She put on soft music in the background. She took a shower. She styled her hair. She wore the navy blue dress. The one Denzel used to say made her look like his first date all over again. She looked at herself in the mirror. She stared into her own eyes. She did not blink. Then she took 2 small bottles from her purse. She had found them through someone at the hospital. She had asked quietly. No one questioned her. She crushed the pills slowly. She stirred them into his wine. By evening, Denzel was home. The hospital had allowed him weekend visits now that he could move with help. He used a cane. He walked slowly, but he was alert. He smiled when he saw the table. He called it beautiful. He said it felt like old times. Latasha smiled too. She served his plate. She poured his wine. She sat across from him and watched him eat. He told her the food tasted better than he remembered. He told her he missed her touch. She told him she missed him too. He drank the wine slowly. Within 20 minutes, his eyes were heavier, his words slower. He tried to finish his plate, but his hands trembled. He leaned back in the chair. He said he felt strange. She told him it was just the wine. He smiled again. A sleepy, soft smile. He reached for her hand. She let him hold it. Then she stood up. She walked to the kitchen. She returned with a small knife. Not the biggest one. Just enough. She walked around to his side of the table. He looked up at her, confused. His head tilted. His eyelids drooped. She bent down and whispered in his ear. I just wanted one last perfect night. Then she moved. Once. Twice. Again. And again. She did not stop. She felt each movement in her arm like a lifetime of weight being released. 27 times she pierced the skin. Each cut a memory. Each cut a moment she had been betrayed. By the time she was done, he was silent. Blood soaked through his shirt. His body was still. Latasha stood up. Her dress was stained. Her face was calm. Latasha stepped back. She stared at him for a long time. Her chest heaved, but she did not cry. Her hands were stained, but they did not shake anymore. She walked into the kitchen and washed the knife. She wiped the counter. She took off the dress and placed it carefully on the bed. Then she sat back down in the chair. She picked up her wine glass. She took a slow sip. For the first time in years there was silence. Real silence. She looked around the room that had held so much pain. And for a moment, she felt something close to peace. Denzel was gone. And she was finally free. Latasha did not run. She did not hide. She sat alone in the living room for almost 2 hours after it was over. Then she picked up her phone and called 911. Her voice was calm. She told the dispatcher there had been a stabbing. She gave them the address and said they should come quickly. When officers arrived, she opened the door herself. She was dressed in clean clothes. Her hands were steady. Denzel's body was found still seated in the dining room. The table was untouched except for one plate and a half-empty glass of wine. The food was cold. The candles had burned low. The kitchen was spotless. Latasha was taken into custody without resistance. She did not speak during the ride to the station. She asked for a lawyer. When they processed her, she did not cry. She answered every question clearly and waited for what came next. By the next morning, the news had spread. A well-known pastor was dead. His wife was in custody. The details of the case had not yet been made public, but rumors moved fast. Within hours, headlines flooded the internet. Talk shows picked up the story. Opinion pieces followed. At Mount Zion Baptist Church, shock turned to outrage. Some members were devastated. Others were confused. A few were quiet, but many turned their anger toward Latasha. Her name was dragged across social media. People accused her of being jealous, bitter, and unstable. Some said she had planned it for years. Others said she had destroyed the legacy of a man who had done so much good. But there were voices on the other side, too. Quiet at first, then louder. They pointed to her years of sacrifice, her silence, her loyalty. They asked why no one had noticed her pain. They questioned how a woman could be pushed to that edge without anyone seeing. In court, the truth was finally spoken. Latasha sat on the witness stand with her hands folded. Her voice never shook. She told the court about the night of the crash. She spoke about the years she spent at Denzel's bedside. She described the moment she found him in the arms of another woman. She told them about the diagnosis, the silence, the betrayal. Then she said something that changed everything. She told the courtroom that the crash 5 years earlier had not been an accident. She had known about the affair with Crystal. She had followed them once. She had seen the way he looked at her. That night, while Denzel slept, Latasha went to the garage and cut the brake lines. She had not planned it for days. Was not careful. It was impulse. She did not think he would die. I thought I'd kill the man who betrayed me, she said. But instead, I kept him alive. Every day I kept him alive. I cleaned his wounds. I paid his bills. I sat by his side while he healed. That was the real punishment. The room fell silent. The prosecutor paused. The judge took a moment before speaking again. Even the jurors looked stunned. The trial continued for days. Witnesses came forward. Nurses spoke about the long hours she stayed at the hospital. A therapist testified about the signs of emotional trauma she had seen. Experts weighed in. The jury had a difficult task. Latasha was found guilty of second-degree murder. The court acknowledged the years of care, the evidence of emotional abuse, and the full circumstances surrounding the case. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10. Outside the courthouse, the crowds remained divided. Some said she deserved life. Others said she had already served one. Inside her cell, Latasha kept a photo of her and Denzel from their early years. She did not speak much. She attended therapy. She wrote letters she never sent. And outside, the story continued. People debated her actions in churches, classrooms, and dinner tables across the country. Some said she was a victim who lost her way. Others said she was proof that even love has a limit. Story 2. She went out for a walk that night and never came home. Her shoes were by the door. Her phone was found in a gutter. Her dog returned alone, leash trailing in the dirt. And the next morning, the city waited for her to testify in court, unaware of the tragedy that was about to hit the news. What happened that night has left Atlanta asking the same question for years. Nadine Brooks stood out in every room she entered. She was known in Atlanta's legal circles as a sharp, determined family law attorney who fought for mothers and children caught in messy divorces or dangerous home situations. She had built her reputation from the ground up, having grown up in a modest household on the Atlanta. With her mother working 2 jobs to support the family, Nadine had learned early what hard work meant. She attended Emory University on scholarships, excelled in law school, and opened her own small practice called Brooks Family Law. Her firm quickly became known for taking on the kinds of cases other attorneys avoided. The hard ones, the painful ones, the ones where vulnerable people had been left with no one else to turn to. Clients admired her. Colleagues respected her. Judges trusted her preparation. In Atlanta's legal world, Nadine was seen as a rising star. Omari Trussell had his own story. Born and raised in the Bankhead neighborhood, Omari was known for his sharp mind and magnetic personality. He joined the Atlanta Police Department straight out of college and quickly rose through the ranks. His record was filled with commendations. He had solved major cases, pulled victims out of dangerous situations, and mentored younger black officers trying to navigate the force. Local news stations often featured him in interviews. Schools asked him to speak to students about law enforcement. To many, Omari was the kind of officer the city needed, smart, tough, and driven. Nadine Brooks and Omari Trussell first crossed paths 12 years ago at a city gala in downtown Atlanta. Nadine had been invited after winning a legal service award for her pro bono work helping domestic violence victims. Omari was being recognized for his role in solving a high-profile missing persons case that had gripped the city. They were seated at the same table, introduced by mutual friends who immediately thought they would be a perfect match. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable spark. Nadine was drawn to Omari's charm, confidence, and commanding presence. Omari admired Nadine's intelligence, passion, and warmth. After the gala, they started seeing each other regularly, squeezing in dinners and late-night phone calls between their busy schedules. Within a year, they married. Their wedding was small but elegant, held in a historic Atlanta church surrounded by family and close friends. Nadine wore a simple satin gown, Omari wore his police dress uniform, and the ceremony was filled with laughter, hope, and prayers for a strong future. A year later, they welcomed their only child, Kiana. Nadine had struggled with pregnancy complications, and when Kiana was finally born, they called her their miracle. For a while, life felt complete, but as their careers advanced, the demands on their time grew. Nadine's law firm expanded, bringing more clients, late nights, and court deadlines. Omari's reputation in the department soared, and he was frequently pulled into complex investigations and task forces. They talked about having a second child, but as the years passed, they both quietly acknowledged that their unpredictable schedules and constant professional demands made it nearly impossible. At home, They had a 10-year-old daughter named Kiana. She was quiet, loved drawing, and often sat with her mother at the kitchen table, coloring while Nadine worked on case files. Friends described the family as picture perfect. Neighbors saw them as the kind of black family that proved anything was possible with determination and love. But behind closed doors, the cracks in their marriage ran deep. Omari had a short temper. He demanded control over household decisions. He frequently criticized Nadine for spending too much time at her office. He complained when she stayed late to meet with clients. He disliked the way her name was starting to carry weight in the community, a weight that sometimes overshadowed his own. Nadine noticed how his compliments had slowly been replaced by sharp remarks. She noticed how he often brushed aside her opinions in conversations, making decisions without including her. She kept her frustrations hidden from friends and family. She told herself that every couple had struggles. She believed that if she focused on Kiana, her career, and keeping the household running smoothly, things would settle down. In public, they continued to play the part, smiling for pictures, attending church on Sundays, and waving to neighbors as they left for work. But at night, when the house was quiet and Kiana was asleep, Nadine found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering when the warmth in their marriage had turned cold. She had built a life many people admired. She had worked for every achievement, earned every accolade, and carved out a place for herself in a world where black women were often told they couldn't rise. And yet, in the place where she should have felt safest, Nadine had begun to feel like a stranger. At first, Nadine thought Kiana was simply going through a rough patch. Kiana had always been a bright and cheerful child, the kind who loved making cards for her teachers and reading storybooks late into the night. But slowly, small changes appeared. Kiana became unusually quiet at home. She no longer wanted to show Nadine her drawings. She no longer asked to go to the park or to have her friends over after school. Nadine noticed Kiana started avoiding sitting too close to Omari. She would flinch slightly when he reached out to touch her shoulder. At bedtime, she no longer wanted Omari to tuck her in. She clung to Nadine instead, and often pleaded to sleep in her mother's bed. The nightmares soon followed. Almost every night, Kiana woke up crying and shaking. Nadine would hold her until she calmed down. When Nadine gently asked what the nightmares were about, Kiana would shake her head and bury her face in her mother's chest. At school, Kiana's teachers reached out. They told Nadine her daughter's grades were dropping. Kiana was distracted in class, staring out the window or doodling in her notebooks instead of focusing on her lessons. She had stopped participating in class discussions and no longer wanted to play with her classmates. Nadine's instincts sharpened. She knew something was wrong. She knew her daughter too well to ignore these signs. She started paying attention to every small detail. She watched Kiana closely at home. She observed how Kiana's eyes darkened with fear whenever Omari entered the room. Late one night, after Kiana had gone to sleep, Nadine sat in the kitchen, staring at the table. She thought about the countless mothers she had helped in court, the women who had come to her firm, desperate and terrified for their children. She remembered how often she had told them to trust their instincts. Nadine decided to act. She quietly installed a small camera in Kiana's bedroom. She placed it where it could not be seen, making sure it was secure and working properly. She told no one. She waited and watched. The footage she collected shattered her. She sat alone in her office late at night, watching the screen with her hand over her mouth. Her husband forcefully had sex with their 10-year-old daughter. Her heart raced. She felt like the air had been punched out of her lungs. She watched the truth unfold before her eyes and felt an unbearable wave of pain, disbelief, and fury. The morning after Nadine watched the devastating footage, she sat in her office staring blankly at her case files. Her coffee had gone cold. She felt numb, her mind replaying what she had seen over and over. Then her phone rang. It was Kiana's school. The voice on the other end was shaky and urgent. Kiana had been rushed to a nearby clinic. Nadine's heart dropped. She grabbed her keys and ran out of the house, barely locking the door behind her. At the clinic, Nadine arrived breathless, her hands trembling. A nurse met her at the entrance and quickly led her down the hallway. In a small examination room, Kiana sat on the table, pale and frightened. Nadine rushed to her daughter's side, hugging her tightly, tears burning in her eyes. Moments later, a doctor came in, a kind-faced woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes. She introduced herself as Dr. Harrison gently asked Nadine to step outside for a moment. Nadine's stomach twisted. She could barely stand still. Dr. Harris spoke carefully but firmly. She explained that Kiana had collapsed at school after complaining of stomach pain and dizziness. During the examination, they ran some tests, and the results had confirmed something unexpected. The doctor looked Nadine straight in the eyes and said, "Your daughter is pregnant." Nadine's entire body went cold. She felt the room tilt as if the walls were closing in. She leaned back against the wall, struggling to process the words. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, whispering, No, this can't be happening." Dr. Harris continued gently but firmly, explaining the health concerns. She said Kiana's body was under extreme stress. She explained that pregnancies at such a young age come with serious risks. Kiana's body was not fully developed, which meant she was at high risk for complications like severe anemia, premature labor, and delivery complications that could threaten both her life and the baby's. The doctor emphasized the urgency of providing proper medical care and psychological support. She stressed that Kiana was emotionally traumatized and would need careful, sensitive handling. She said, "This isn't just a medical case, Ms. Brooks. This is a deeply serious situation, and we need to act quickly to protect your daughter." Nadine felt her knees weaken. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a choked sob. Her mind raced, bouncing between anger, sorrow, guilt, and rage. How had this been happening under her own roof? How had she not seen it sooner? How could the man she had built her life with be the one to shatter their world this way? She wiped her face, pulled herself together, and looked Dr. Harris in the eyes. Her voice was shaky but determined. She said, "Do whatever you need to do for her. I will handle the rest." Nadine walked back into the room where Kiana sat quietly, her small hands folded in her lap. Nadine knelt beside her daughter, wrapped her arms around her, and whispered in her ear, "Mommy's here. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I promise you, baby, we're going to get through this." That night, after leaving the clinic with Kiana safely resting in her room, Nadine sat alone in the living room. The house was silent, but her mind raced. She stared at the front door, waiting for Omari to come home. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had spent the entire afternoon holding Kiana close, trying to stay calm, but the rage inside her was boiling. When Omari walked through the door, the tension hit immediately. He smiled faintly, setting down his keys, as if nothing in the world was wrong. Nadine stood up, her arms crossed tightly. Omari paused, sensing something. He tilted his head, gave a cautious look and asked, "What's wrong?" Nadine stepped closer, her voice shaking but firm. She told him she knew everything. She told him she had seen the footage. She told him she had just come back from the clinic and knew about Kiana's pregnancy. Omari's face changed in an instant. His smile vanished, his eyes darkened. He raised his voice, accusing Nadine of misunderstanding, of blowing things out of proportion. He shouted that she was trying to destroy their family. He called her dramatic. He insisted that she was making things up in her head. Nadine did not back down. She stood her ground. She told him she had all the evidence saved and backed up. She told him she had already spoken to experts. She reminded him that she was not just his wife. She was a lawyer. She knew exactly how to handle this, and she knew how to protect her child. Omari's rage filled the room. He paced, shouted, slammed his hand on the wall. He reminded Nadine of his position, of his connections in the department, of how no one would believe her over him. He sneered, saying she would ruin everything they had built if she went public. Nadine's heart raced, but she kept her voice calm. She told him clearly that this was not a negotiation. She told him she had already made her decision. She was filing charges, she was reporting everything. She was going to protect Kiana, no matter what it cost. The weight of that moment hung in the air. Nadine knew that the man standing in front of her was not the man she had married. The mask had fallen. The truth was out, and from that moment, she understood fully that she was no longer speaking to her husband. She was facing the man who had become the enemy of her child. The next morning, Nadine called her contacts at the Atlanta Police Department. She scheduled a formal meeting with detectives in the Special Victims Unit. She prepared her legal files, printed her evidence, and secured Kiana's medical and psychological reports. She worked with quiet determination, knowing that every detail mattered. By the end of the week, Nadine walked into the police department with her head held high. She gave her statement. She handed over every piece of evidence. She filed formal charges against Omari Trussell, the same man who had once been honored by the department, the same man whose badge had shielded him for years. After filing the charges against Omari, Nadine quickly realized that the fight was larger than she had imagined. While the Atlanta Police Department suspended Omari, placing him on administrative leave pending investigation. Nadine saw signs that the process was slowing. Important files went missing. Requests for interviews were quietly delayed. Officers she once trusted hesitated to update her. She could feel Omari's influence pushing back from inside the department, using his badge and years of loyalty to stall every move. But Nadine was determined to leave nothing unchecked. She worked tirelessly alongside the prosecutors, preparing every detail of the case. She met with Kiana's doctors, who provided more detailed medical records. She arranged for Kiana's therapist to prepare a more robust psychological evaluation report. She built a list of expert witnesses who specialized in child sexual abuse, often referred to in court by its formal term, child sexual exploitation or child molestation. While gathering evidence, Nadine made a shocking discovery. One evening, working late in her office, she began reviewing old internal case reports tied to Omari's time at the department. She filed a formal request through her legal contacts and gained access to reports from the department's archives. As she read through them, her chest tightened. She found several reports of suspected child sexual abuse that had been quietly closed without clear resolution. What shook her most were two cases where the offender, the person named as the suspected abuser, was Omari himself. The reports were thin, vague, and marked as resolved, but the names and details were clear. In one, a teenage girl reported that a family friend, identified as Omari, had crossed boundaries and acted inappropriately. In another, a neighbor's child had made a statement about Omari's conduct, which was logged, but never followed up. Both cases had been buried inside the department, filed away under layers of bureaucracy and internal silence. Nadine sat alone in her office, hands shaking as she read through the reports. The realization hit her hard. Kiana was not the first. The warning signs had been there all along, but no one had acted. Omari's reputation had shielded him for years. His badge had protected him from investigation. This discovery fueled Nadine's resolve. She immediately handed the reports over to the prosecutors, adding them to the growing list of evidence. She contacted the families named in the and encouraged them to come forward. One mother, after years of silence, agreed to testify, bringing her own painful story into the courtroom. Behind the scenes, Omari fought back. He hired a defense attorney with a sharp reputation. He called in favors, whispering to former colleagues that Nadine was trying to destroy him out of revenge. He planted doubt among people who had once respected his wife. He played the victim, claiming that Nadine was exaggerating the facts and using the legal system to punish him personally. After gathering the damning reports and preparing the formal charges, Nadine knew there was still one more step she had to take. She could no longer live under the same roof with Omari. She waited until Kiana was resting safely with her aunt for the weekend. Then, she sat down across from Omari in the living room. Her face was calm, but her voice was firm. She told him she had filed for divorce. She told him she had already spoken to a family law judge and filed the necessary paperwork. There would be no discussion. There would be no negotiation. She made it clear the decision was final. Omari sat silently for a moment, his eyes fixed on her. His jaw tightened. Then, without a word, he stood up, grabbed his keys, and left the house. That night, Omari moved out of the home they had shared for over a decade. Nadine watched him go, but the pain didn't leave. She locked the doors, walked through each room, and sat down on the edge of Kiana's bed. The house felt different. The weight of his presence was gone, but the shadow of what he had done remained. Nadine knew this was only the beginning. The legal battle was ahead. The courtroom fights were coming. The night before the trial, Nadine sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet, but her mind was crowded with thoughts. She had spent weeks preparing evidence, working with lawyers, and making sure Kiana was safe with her aunt. She had walked through every possible argument the defense might raise. She had memorized every timeline, every report, every witness statement. She was ready for court, but her heart was heavy. She had once imagined standing beside Omari as a partner, not facing him as an opponent. She had once believed in their family's future, not preparing to take the witness stand against the man she had loved. Needing air, Nadine reached for Shadow's leash. Shadow was a strong pit bull, loyal and always alert. She clipped the leash to his collar, tied her shoes, and stepped outside. The evening air was cool and calm. The street lights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. Nadine walked slowly, letting the dog set the pace. She watched her breath curl into the night and tried to clear her mind. She never came back. Hours later, Shadow scratched at the front door, barking and whining. The next morning, the courthouse was filled. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, reporters, and court staff moved through the halls, checking their notes and preparing for the trial everyone in Atlanta was watching. This was a priority case. A decorated police detective standing accused by his own wife of the most unforgivable crime. The lead prosecutor waited by the courtroom doors, glancing at the clock. Nadine Brooks was supposed to be there by now. She was the key witness, the woman whose testimony would open the case and set the entire tone for the trial. But she had not arrived. They called her cell phone. No answer. They called her office. No answer. They called the aunt who was caring for Kiana. She said Nadine had gone out for a walk the night before, but never came back. The prosecutor's stomach dropped. They tried again, calling Nadine's cell phone over and over. Nadine was still in the courtroom, hoping she would pick up. Her legal team joined in, pacing the courthouse hallway, whispering to each other, trying to stay calm. After an hour, the prosecutor made the decision. They called the police. Patrol officers were sent to Nadine's home. When they arrived, they found Omari already there. He stood outside, arms crossed, past, speaking quietly to a neighbor. Officers approached cautiously, asking if Nadine was inside. Omari calmly told them she had left the night before and never returned. He said the dog had come back alone, muddy and dragging its broken leash. He explained that he assumed Nadine needed space and had not expected her to stay out all night. The officers called it in. More patrol cars arrived. Soon, the street outside Nadine's home was lined with police tape and flashing lights. Investigators moved through the house, checking for signs of forced entry, signs of a struggle, any trace of where Nadine might have gone. Inside, Omari sat at the kitchen table, answering every question without hesitation. He kept his voice calm. He maintained that Nadine had been under enormous pressure, that the trial had overwhelmed her, that maybe she had simply walked away to clear her mind. The prosecutor arrived at the house that afternoon, standing quietly outside the police line. They watched as officers moved in and out of the home, knowing the trial could not begin without Nadine. She was the cornerstone of the case. Without her, they would be left scrambling. They also wondered why he was at home and not in court with his lawyers. Did he know Nadine won't show up? Meanwhile, word spread across Atlanta. News crews set up near the courthouse and outside Nadine's home. Reporters whispered about the powerful attorney who had vanished the night before she was set to bring down her husband in court. As the sun set, the search widened. Officers canvassed nearby streets, questioned neighbors, and checked local hospitals. Kiana, kept away from the scene by her aunt, waited quietly in another part of the city, unaware of the full weight of what was unfolding. As the hours passed and no sign of Nadine was found, Omari Trussell stepped into the public spotlight. He stood outside the house, giving interviews to local reporters. He spoke softly, his face strained, his words carefully chosen. He told the cameras he was heartbroken. He said he was worried for his wife. He asked anyone with information to come forward. Omari called on his old contacts within the police department. He made sure search teams were organized. He volunteered to help review incoming tips. He gave public statements that made him appear like a desperate husband, doing everything he could to bring his wife home. On television, his face was everywhere. His voice filled the news segments. But behind closed doors, things were shifting. Investigators noticed strange details in the early hours of the search. One officer reported that key evidence collected from Nadine's personal belongings went missing from the storage room. Another officer found that Nadine's phone records, which had been requested by the lead detective, were suddenly marked as restricted. CCTV footage from the streets near Nadine's last known location was requested, but when the data arrived, large sections were blacked out. The timestamps were missing. The video feed was incomplete. Technical staff could not explain why. The investigation team started feeling the weight of Omari's long career with the department. He knew the procedures. He knew where evidence was stored. He knew who to contact. He understood how cases were processed. Omari's long experience as a detective gave him an edge that few suspects ever had. He was always one step ahead. He knew how to shift focus. He knew when to offer help and when to stay silent. He kept his public image clean while quietly pulling strings behind the scenes. The lead investigators, while careful with their words, began meeting privately to review every move Omari made. They compared notes, cross-checked files, and quietly expanded the investigation beyond the public eye. They had to work carefully. Any slip-up could tip Omari off. Detectives reviewing the case began noticing clear inconsistencies in Omari's timeline. He told investigators he had been home the entire night, from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., waiting for Nadine to return from her walk. But a patrol car dash camera placed Omari across town at 9:42 p.m., near an industrial lot on the edge of the city. When questioned about his efforts to reach Nadine, Omari claimed he had called her phone several times between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. The call logs, however, told a different story. Records showed only one call placed from Omari's phone to Nadine's cell phone, and that single attempt was made much later, at 11:27 p.m., nearly 4 hours after she had left the house. Detectives quietly documented each discrepancy. In the media, Omari's face remained the picture of a grieving husband, pleading for answers. But in the investigation rooms, suspicion was growing. The officers who once called Omari a friend were now asking the question no one wanted to say out loud. Was Omari Trussell using everything he knew from inside the system to cover up the disappearance of his own wife? The rescheduled day of the trial arrived, but the atmosphere inside the courthouse had completely changed. Reporters gathered outside, whispering about Nadine's disappearance. Police officers stood quietly in the hallways, exchanging glances. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution team sat tense, knowing their star witness was missing, but refusing to let the case fall apart. Under Georgia law, the case was allowed to continue. Nadine had worked tirelessly before she vanished, ensuring her files were complete and all evidence had been handed over to the legal team. She had prepared detailed statements, backed by expert reports, witness lists, and medical records. The prosecutors had everything they needed to press forward. The judge called the room to order. The prosecution began presenting its case, starting with recorded testimony from Kiana. The courtroom grew painfully still as Kiana's video played on the large screen. The 10-year-old sat beside her therapist, softly describing her experiences. Her voice was quiet, but her words were clear. The details were heartbreaking. The jury watched closely. The defense team fidgeted, realizing that the child's testimony carried a weight that could not be undone. Next came the forensic evidence. The medical records from the clinic were presented, confirming Kiana's pregnancy. The psychologist's detailed report was read aloud, outlining the trauma Kiana had suffered. The court heard from expert witnesses Nadine had arranged in advance, each one adding strength to the case. The defense attempted to push back. They questioned the reliability of the testimony, suggesting Kiana was too young to fully understand what had happened. They claimed the evidence was incomplete without Nadine's live account. But the facts were too solid to dismiss. The prosecutors laid out the timeline, the buried reports from past cases, and the pattern of abuse Nadine had uncovered. As the trial unfolded, pressure built outside the courtroom. Members of the police department were called to testify. Internal affairs officers presented findings from their investigation. The courtroom became a tense, focused space, where every detail was weighed carefully. On the third day of the trial, a decision was made. Omari Trussell, who had continued showing up to court wearing his police badge and dressed sharply, was called into the judge's chambers. There, surrounded by federal officers and internal affairs investigators, he was placed under arrest. News cameras caught the moment he was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs. His face remained calm, his expression controlled. Reporters shouted questions, flashing cameras lit up the sidewalk, and bystanders watched in stunned silence. Inside the department, his former colleagues watched the footage, struggling to process the fall of a man they had once respected. Even without Nadine standing in the courtroom, her work spoke for her. Her files, her careful preparation, and her determination to protect her daughter carried the case forward. 2 weeks after the trial ended, investigators received a tip from a local worker near the industrial lot where Omari had been seen on dash camera footage. The worker had noticed a strange smell coming from a sealed drainage tunnel. Police arrived at the scene and began a careful search. Inside the tunnel, they made the discovery everyone had feared. Nadine Brooks' body was found, hidden and wrapped in heavy material. She had been left in a place that only someone familiar with the area would know how to access without drawing attention. Forensic teams moved in quickly. They collected fingerprint evidence from the materials used to cover Nadine's body. They recovered trace samples from inside Omari's car that matched fibers found at the site. They pulled detailed phone records, placing Omari near the location at the exact time Nadine went missing. The evidence was clear and undeniable. The courtroom filled again as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. Omari stood silently, dressed in a plain prison uniform, his face expressionless. The room was tense. Nadine's family sat together in the front row, holding hands, their faces marked by grief and quiet strength. The judge read the sentence with a firm, unwavering voice. Omari Trussell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained still as the judge delivered a final, cutting rebuke. The judge said, "The badge you wore made you powerful. The crimes you committed made you a monster." Across Atlanta, news of the sentence spread quickly. People gathered for candlelight vigils, holding photos of Nadine, placing flowers outside her office, and lighting candles near the courthouse steps. The city mourned, but questions lingered. How many people had been harmed before Nadine came forward? How had Omari's actions been hidden for so long? Could the system truly deliver justice when the person breaking the law wore a badge? The case left Atlanta shaken. For Nadine's family, the verdict was a measure of justice, but it could never replace the loss they had suffered. For the community, her memory became a symbol of courage, a reminder of what it means to stand up against even the most trusted faces when the truth is at stake. Story 3. April 3rd, 2024 was a special day. It was the long-awaited birthday of James Blake, the only son of his family and the CEO of a thriving healthcare firm in South Florida. The celebration was held at his luxurious waterfront home in Golden Beach. Despite the quiet tension in his marriage, James was determined to mark his 30th birthday in style. The guest list was exclusive. The house was filled with laughter, toasts, music, and a father's proud smile in the background. James walked the room like a man who had made it. He had status, success, and the kind of confidence that made people forget the rumors. But what no one saw coming was what happened that same night. No one expected the screaming. No one expected that by the next morning, a family would be shattered and a mother would be sitting in a cold hospital hallway, waiting for a doctor to say the one thing she wasn't ready to hear. This is a case that leaves detectives scrambling for answers. They were suspects, but the deeper they looked, the more it slipped out of Detective Phillips' hands. Something wasn't right. Timelines didn't match. Questions kept opening more questions. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about control, silence, and the price paid when truth threatens power. This is the case of James Blake. When you hear a man was poisoned, your mind goes to enemies, a rival, a deal gone wrong. Maybe someone from the outside with a grudge and enough time to plan. That's what people assumed when James Blake died on April 3rd, 2024, his own birthday. But before there was poison, there was a family. One that knew how to look perfect for everyone watching. The Blakes weren't just respected, they were studied. Their name carried weight in Florida's business and faith communities. It started with Michael Blake. Michael, James' father, built his empire from nothing. With hard work and zeal, Michael built a marketing and consulting firm that grew into a household name across South Florida. Hospitals, insurance companies, nonprofits, even campaign work during election cycles. Michael's hands were everywhere, but his face? Always calm, always clean. He was the man who stood in pulpits and award stages with the same suit, same smile, and the same reputation. He made it clear, his brand was family, his faith, his discipline. People wanted what he had, and they believed him when he said it came from hard work and a clean conscience. Then there was Mary. She wasn't just the pastor's wife type. She had her own record, 20 years in ICU nursing. However, she walked away from it the day James, her only child, launched his first medical consulting platform. She called it a mother's investment. But she did more than invest. Mary protected the peace of that home, held the Sunday routines, led prayer circles, baked for funerals, cried with the church women. If Michael was the power, Mary was the calm. And everyone saw it. For James, he was the only child, the one everything was poured into. From the outside, he was exactly what you'd expect. A polished, confident young man with a vision. He didn't just inherit his father's ambition, he multiplied it. While Michael worked behind closed doors, James lived out loud. At 24, he was already building his own firm. Not an extension of his father's, but something newer, leaner, focused on healthcare administration and reform. He didn't want to stay in his father's shadow. He wanted to own the light. He did it fast. By 27, he had government contracts, private hospital deals, and corporate medical accounts that made headlines. He bought a waterfront home before his 30th birthday, had 2 kids with his wife, Jenny. And when you Googled Black excellence in Florida healthcare, his face was in the first row. But the image didn't tell the full story. Behind those clean suits and magazine quotes, James was restless. People close to him described it as driven. Others called it something else. He partied hard, moved through women before settling down. Always working, always distracted. Sometimes disappearing for days, even weeks, claiming strategy sessions or client retreats. His wife kept smiling for pictures, but friends noticed how quiet she'd become. The spark they saw on their wedding day was long gone. Still, nobody questioned it, not publicly. Not when the checks were clearing. Not when the house kept getting bigger. Not when his name was tied to success. But despite the success, there were moments, quiet, forgettable ones, where things didn't quite fit, like when Michael would take private calls and lower his voice. Mary, as the trusting wife, would brush off concerns with soft laughter. In all, the Blakes were practiced. They had done this for decades. Hold the smile. Say the right words. Handle everything inside the house. That's what made the case so sensational. Because when a man like James dies at 30 from something that doesn't make sense, people don't just grieve. They dig. And when they dug into the Blakes, they found more than they were prepared for. But all that came later. And so for all, the Blakes were everything a successful American family was supposed to be. Wealthy, united, unbothered. Their neighbors spoke highly of them. Their church honored them annually. Their business partners praised their integrity. No police records. No public drama. No scandal. Just three people holding up an image they built together. But even the best image can't survive pressure forever. Something had started changing. It didn't show up in headlines or photos. It showed up in the silences between conversations. In the missing pieces of a family that looked whole but wasn't. By the time James planned his 30th birthday party, something in that house had already shifted. A decision had already been made. And for a family that spent their lives staying ahead of trouble, none of them saw how close it had gotten. The Blakes weren't falling apart. They were already broken. They just hadn't noticed yet. For 2 decades, Michael Blake lived a second life. One that didn't show up in the speeches he gave at church, the awards on his office wall, or the newspaper columns praising his devotion to family values. It didn't slip through during interviews or neighborhood functions. It was cleanly kept, carefully managed, and hidden in plain sight. Her name was Diana Shaw, Mary's best friend since college. She wasn't just close to the family. She was part of it. She knew the layout of their home. She had a key to the back gate. She watched James grow up. She held Mary's hand at her mother's funeral. She stood beside her at anniversaries. But when Michael wasn't home, it wasn't always because of late meetings or out-of-town clients. Sometimes he was at Diana's. Quiet, untraceable, trusted. It started simple, friendly, then secretive. And before long, it turned into something permanent. Over 20 years, they built something off the books. 4 children, all raised by Diana. No official records tying them to Michael. No public claims. No photos posted together. He paid cash. Bought the house she lived in. Covered tuition. Gave instructions. But never left proof. He never mentioned their names in public. Never brought them to work. Never once risked being seen with all of them in the same room. And somehow, for 20 years, it worked. Diana didn't push. She knew her place in the arrangement. She stayed close to Mary, smiled for pictures, and never overstepped. She played her role perfectly. Best friend. Confidant. People in their circle saw it as loyalty. Long-standing friendship. No one suspected how far it really went. When Mary called, Diana came. When the Blakes had guests over, she helped with the setup. When Michael spoke from the pulpit about fidelity and the strength of marriage, she sat just rows behind his wife and clapped. The children grew, each with Michael's features. Same eyes, same posture. But to outsiders, they were Diana's kids from a past relationship. She kept it vague, and Michael made sure no one asked twice. Money does that. Presence without explanation does that too. He made himself known just enough to maintain control and distant enough to avoid questions. Diana's oldest son, Marcus, had started working at a small administrative office linked to one of Michael's subsidiaries. On paper, it was nothing, but in Michael's plan, it was everything. He'd slowly begun shifting interest, preparing something long-term, something that didn't involve James. James had no idea. None of them did. Not Mary, not Jenny, not Daniel. James never suspected that the man he worked so hard to impress had already chosen someone else to carry the legacy. Not once in all his meetings with his father did he see it. Michael played it cold, never too proud, never too affectionate. Just enough presence to keep James climbing. Just enough pressure to make him feel like he hadn't earned it yet. The lie wasn't just about the affair. It was the structure Michael built to protect it. The fake names, the diverted bank accounts, the paid-off silence, the trust documents tucked into corporate files, and the quiet phone calls to Diana after Sunday services. There was no room for mistakes. And for 20 years, there weren't any. But that was changing. What Michael didn't expect, what he underestimated, was James's ambition, his sharpness, his access. As James's healthcare company grew, so did his involvement in the deeper layers of the business. Financial audits, legacy planning, and questions about the future. That's where the cracks began to show. Quiet inconsistencies, missing documents, business filings that didn't match. At first, James didn't think much of it. He figured it was old restructuring paperwork, something minor. But the deeper he went, the more things felt off. Names he didn't recognize, transfers he hadn't approved, and people connected to firms he'd never dealt with. He flagged it mentally, told himself he'd ask when the time was right. But the time never came. Michael had his own concerns. He could feel James getting too close, not emotionally, but practically. He was getting into places he wasn't supposed to be, asking the kinds of questions you only ask when you're preparing to lead, not follow. For Michael, that was dangerous, because once James pulled the wrong thread, everything could come apart. Not just the business, the image, the name, the control. Still, Michael didn't panic. He watched, waited, calculated. And Diana, she followed his lead. She didn't ask about James. She didn't talk to Mary about the stress in the home. She played her part, smiling, showing up, keeping the lie alive. But behind the smiles, the walls were moving. A lie that had lasted 20 years doesn't break overnight. It breaks in quiet decisions, in hidden signatures, in meetings where one man starts planning for a future without the son the world assumed he'd chosen. That part hadn't reached James yet, but it would. For all the discipline James Blake inherited from his father, there was one thing he never fully learned. Boundaries. The ones that separate business from desire, loyalty from convenience, right from what feels good in the moment. By the time he hit his late 20s, James had built the kind of life that didn't require explanation. He had money, power, and the kind of charm that made people forgive almost anything. But underneath the headlines and executive suits, there were habits he never broke. One of them was Sophia Williams. Sophia wasn't just anyone. She was the wife of Daniel Williams, James' closest friend since they were teenagers. They met in 10th grade, survived college together, shared hotel rooms during business travel, and stood side by side at each other's weddings. Daniel trusted James with everything. So when Sophia confided in James during one of their many dinners, it didn't raise red flags. She said Daniel had become cold, distracted, different. James listened, gave advice, nodded like a brother. What followed wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. One that started quietly, then never stopped. It began during a weekend in Tampa. James had invited Daniel's family to join him for an event. Daniel couldn't make it. Sophia came alone. That night, in a hotel suite paid for by the company card, they crossed a line. What should have been a one-time lapse became a routine. From Tampa to Atlanta to D.C., Sophia started showing up. No questions, no guilt. At least not from James. He didn't hide it at first. Not from himself. And in his mind, that was enough. Back home, Jenny knew something was wrong. She didn't have proof. Not at first. But the signs were clear. James had changed. He stopped calling when he traveled. Started locking his phone. Came home smelling like unfamiliar perfume. There were moments he forgot what lie he told last. One night she saw a message flash on his phone while he was asleep. It was from an unknown caller ID. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. But the content told her everything. It read, "I can't wait to have you again, baby." Jenny never confronted him directly. She just stopped asking questions. She had 2 children under 6 and no steady income. Leaving wasn't simple. And truthfully, she didn't know where she would go if she did. Still, the silence between them grew heavier. They slept in the same bed, but lived on separate islands. When they appeared in public, they played the role. Hand-holding, laughter at company dinners, coordinated outfits on Sundays. But at home, Jenny barely spoke, and James barely made an attempt. He soon stopped pretending he was hiding anything, and she stopped pretending she wanted him to. Daniel remained in the dark. His trust in James was untouched. He saw his friend as the one person who understood the pressure of success, the demands of being a husband and a father, the weight of being counted on. He talked about his marriage with James, asked for advice, brought him into conversations that should have stayed inside his home. And James gave answers with a straight face, told Daniel to be patient, told him to listen more, to be present. It was manipulation, strategic and cruel. James had the access, the history, and the opportunity, and he used all of it. Sophia never stopped showing up in their usual hidden places. Once at a vacation house in Naples, the same one Daniel helped him renovate. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was layered. James betrayed Daniel's loyalty, Jenny's trust, his own values. And deeper than that, he repeated the pattern just like his father. A life built on lies, held together by image and silence. If Michael's deception was about control, James's was about ego. He didn't need to cheat. He wanted to. It gave him power. It reminded him that he was untouchable. Or so he believed. But these weren't secrets that could stay buried forever. People notice patterns. They remember timelines. Sophia became careless. She mentioned things in front of people she shouldn't have. There were rumors in the circle, side glances at parties, passive-aggressive remarks from Jenny during dinners. And while Daniel was still clueless, others were beginning to suspect. James didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He became more reckless. In his mind, the damage was already done. There was no going back, and he wasn't interested in saving anything. He stopped showing up for counseling, stopped answering late-night calls from Jenny, started disappearing on weekends without notice. If anyone asked, he blamed work. But it wasn't just infidelity. It was the erosion of every relationship that once meant something. He didn't just break vows. He stepped on the very friendships and family ties that had shaped his world. And while the fallout hadn't come yet, the foundation was already weakened. What James didn't know was how fast consequences could arrive when too many people are hurt, and too many lies start overlapping. The affair wasn't just a personal mistake. It became part of something bigger, something that would expose him publicly, drag others into pain they didn't ask for, and ultimately lead to a confrontation he wasn't ready for. But all that was still ahead. For now, James was still in control, still lying, still winning, still blind to how many people were quietly turning away from him, watching, waiting, and counting. It started with an envelope, one with no return address and markings, just his name typed on the front, James Blake, and a Florida postmark dated March 18, 2024. It arrived at his downtown office inside a routine stack of corporate mail. He almost threw it away, but something about the plainness made him pause. The contents were brief. 2 pages. A laboratory-issued paternity confirmation, complete with patient numbers and legal identifiers. It didn't take long to understand what he was looking at. Michael Blake, Diana Shaw, 4 children, confirmed paternity. At first, James didn't believe it. He skimmed the pages again, trying to find a reason to doubt it. Maybe it was fake. But the names matched. The dates matched. And worst of all, the testing center was one his own healthcare firm had worked with before. The paperwork was real. And so was the implication. His father, the man who had drilled discipline and honor into him since childhood, had been sleeping with Mary, his mother-best friend, for decades. And the children? They were grown. One of them even worked at a satellite firm connected to his father's consulting group. He sat in silence for several minutes. Then he picked up his phone. Not to call his mother. Not to call Jenny. He called the legal department. He had questions now, and none of them were going away. By March 21st, James had quietly reviewed several financial reports from Blake and Partners. Hidden investments, silent transfers, operational funds marked discretionary with no clear recipient. And more troubling, several ownership documents recently amended, moving future control of a subsidiary firm to an unnamed third-party trust. When James connected the names listed on those papers to the paternity documents, it confirmed everything. His father hadn't just cheated. He had started building an empire around a second family. Quietly, legally, and without any intention of telling his only son. On March 25th, James arrived at the corporate headquarters earlier than usual. He parked in the executive lot, skipped the front reception, and took the back stairwell to the top floor. He didn't knock. He walked straight into Michael's office and closed the door behind him. For the first minute, neither of them said anything. Michael looked up from his desk, surprised, but not rattled. James placed the envelope down in front of him. Michael didn't open it. James kept his voice calm. He wasn't there to ask questions. He was there to make a point. He told his father that he knew about Diana. that he had proof of the children, that he had already reviewed the legal adjustments to the business. And then he said it plainly. He wanted the documents reversed. He wanted his name restored as the primary beneficiary in all estate filings. And if that didn't happen, he would go public. To the church, to the board, to the media. He wasn't bluffing. He told Michael, his father, that he didn't care about the affair. He cared about him being humiliated. And if that was how his father wanted to move forward, he wouldn't go quietly. Michael didn't respond. He didn't nod. He didn't blink. He just stared at his son, his only son from his wife Mary, and sat in silence. James waited, then repeated himself. Same demand. Same terms. Still nothing. And after another minute, he stood up, picked up the envelope, and left the office. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. He walked out calm, focused. But what he didn't know, what no one knew at that point, was that everything changed the moment he left that room. Within 3 days, James began contacting legal advisors outside the family firm. He asked questions about whistleblower protections, asked how to handle disclosure of internal fraud. On March 30th, he requested a digital audit of 3 additional departments tied to Michael's company. He kept it quiet, but not invisible. People noticed. His assistant mentioned his mood had changed. He was working longer hours. He wasn't picking up calls from Jenny. He even missed a meeting with a key investor. A rare move for James. Meanwhile, Michael didn't say a word. Not to his partners. Not to his wife. Not to Diana. He went about business like nothing had happened. But behind closed doors, his movements changed. Bank activity froze. Access logs to internal documents were pulled. A private meeting was held with the firm's general counsel. And shortly after, one of the trusts tied to Diana's oldest son was legally finalized and sealed. James didn't know that yet. But Michael was moving faster than he thought. By April 1st, James confirmed he would attend the birthday party of James. He had originally planned to skip it, but after the confrontation, he told Jenny he had changed his mind. He said he wanted to be present. She didn't press him. That same night, he received a call from Daniel. They hadn't spoken in weeks. The conversation was short, tense, but polite. It ended with a simple, "I'll see you there." No one knew that conversation would be one of the last James ever had. Whatever James thought would come next, confrontation, press fallout, maybe even legal fights. He had no idea what had already been decided. He thought the worst outcome would be exposure. He never considered the alternative. April 3rd, 2024 was a warm Thursday evening in Golden Beach, South Florida. By 3 p.m., the private road outside James Blake's waterfront estate was lined with luxury vehicles, SUVs, black sedans. Guests were walking up the stone driveway with monogrammed invitations still clutched in their hands. Inside, caterers moved through the hall with trays of cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, and a jazz trio played softly from the back patio. It was the kind of celebration you'd expect from someone like James. Big, stylish, carefully curated. He was turning 30, and for a man like him, it wasn't just a birthday. It was a declaration. The guest list was made up of close friends, business partners, family, and a few names invited more for optics than connection. People whispered about his recent success, his growing footprint in healthcare, the new contract signed just weeks before. James walked through the house with a drink in his hand and a smile that didn't leave his face. But those who knew him well saw it for what it was. Performance. At 6:30 p.m., his father, Michael Blake, arrived. He wore a deep navy suit and walked in without hesitation, nodding politely at guests as he moved toward the back of the house. In his hand was a wooden box, gift-wrapped, no tag, no card, just a black ribbon tied across the top. James met him near the kitchen. They shook hands, no hug, no extra words exchanged. Michael placed the box on the table between them and opened it slightly so James could peek inside. It was a bottle of 1982 Bordeaux, vintage, pricey, and taped to the side of the velvet casing was a folded slip of paper. One word written in his father's clean handwriting, legacy. James held the bottle up, nodded, and turned away before his father could say anything else. By 7:15 p.m., the house was full. Daniel Williams arrived with his 2 sons, but came alone. Sophia wasn't with him. When someone asked why, he said she wasn't feeling well. He said it with a straight face. No one pressed further. Jenny Blake had been in the corner of the room most of the evening, keeping conversation light and brief. She looked good, gold dress, hair pinned neatly, smile intact, but her eyes had been tracking James since the moment he entered the room. Sophia arrived 20 minutes later, alone, dressed in black, confident like she belonged. She hugged Mary, kissed a few guests on the cheek, then made her way to the back where James was talking to two hospital administrators. The hug between them wasn't long, but it was enough for Jenny to notice. Enough for Daniel, standing by the fireplace, to look down and tighten his grip around his glass. At 5:30 p.m., the mood shifted. Jenny walked straight up to James during a toast break. No music playing, no distraction, just voices and low chatter across the house. She said his name, firm but low. He turned to face her. Their conversation lasted no more than 40 seconds. Then she said something that made him stop smiling. His expression dropped. He said nothing, just looked past her and reached for a drink. 5 minutes later, Daniel approached. He wasn't loud. He didn't make a scene. He waited until James was alone by the wine cart. No one heard what he said, but those nearby could see it wasn't casual. James didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just stared at Daniel and laughed under his breath. Daniel stepped back, said something else, and walked off. Neither man raised a hand, but what passed between them said enough. By 7:00 p.m., the cake was being set on the dining table. A few guests had started gathering with phones ready for photos. James walked back toward the crowd, pulled the wine bottle from the wooden box, and popped the cork himself. He poured one glass, raised it slightly, smiled at the guests around him, and said to Legacy. It was Michael's gift. He took a slow sip, then kept moving. Over the next 15 minutes, James made his rounds. He danced with his daughter, gave a quick thank you to the business partners who flew in, shared a brief, awkward hug with Jenny near the hallway, but said nothing more. He had another drink, then switched to water. He didn't sit down. He didn't stop moving. But those who watched him closely noticed something. By 8:30 p.m., James was on the far side of the backyard talking to two guests when he reached for the railing with one hand. He leaned slightly, blinked hard, and then looked around like something had gone wrong. Seconds later, he dropped the glass in his hand. It shattered on the deck. That's when he collapsed. At first, people thought he fainted. Then came the convulsions. Someone screamed. Jenny rushed toward him, but froze when she saw the foam in his mouth. Daniel pulled his phone and called 911. Mary screamed James' name over and over. Michael stood 10 feet away, saying nothing. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes. But by the time they loaded him into the ambulance, James Blake was unresponsive. He was pronounced dead at 9:49 p.m. It was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone, a chance to reset. Instead, it marked the end of everything. And as his body was rushed away, no one had answers, only questions, and a wine bottle sitting half empty near the edge of the deck. Word didn't take long to spread. Guests who had left early started texting. Others waited in the hospital lobby, unsure of what they were walking into. By midnight, the waiting room was filled with whispers, wet eyes, and questions no one knew how to answer. Jenny sat with her face buried in her hands. Daniel stood against the far wall, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Mary had been taken into a separate room. She hadn't spoken since the doctor told her son was gone. And still Michael said nothing. Police were notified before sunrise. Any unexpected death at a private event triggers a process, especially when there's no prior medical history and no visible injury. Detectives arrived just before 6 a.m. They began taking names, collecting statements. They started with the people closest to James. Jenny, his wife, and Daniel, his best friend. Based on their quick investigation and findings, Jenny had every reason to be angry. She knew James had cheated. She'd lived with the silence, raised his children, stood by his side in public. And just hours before his collapse, she'd confronted him in front of guests. People heard her raise her voice, saw the tension, remembered the way she pulled away after whispering something only he could hear. Then there was Daniel. His connection to Sophia wasn't a rumor anymore. It had been outed that night. Quiet, but devastating. He looked James in the eye and said something only the two of them heard. Less than an hour later, James was on the ground. It wasn't hard to see why detectives started there. They were the ones with the wounds, the ones with the anger, the ones who were closest. But there was one problem. Neither of them had a clear opportunity. Security cameras at the house were limited, but nothing showed either Jenny or Daniel near the drinks or the bottle that had been gifted by Michael. The glass James used was untouched by anyone else that evening. No fingerprints out of place, no signs of tampering in the kitchen, and neither of them had left the gathering at any point during the night. Their timelines were too tight. Still, police had to start somewhere. Jenny was questioned first. Her voice was flat. She didn't deny the argument. She admitted that things were tense, but she denied having anything to do with his death. When asked what she believed happened, she said, "I don't know. I wish I did." She didn't cry. She just sat there waiting to be dismissed. Daniel was next. His posture was rigid. His answers were sharp. When asked if he knew about the affair, he said yes. When asked if he'd confronted James, he nodded. "I told him he was a coward," Daniel said. "That's all I said." He didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. When they pressed further, asking where he'd been just before James collapsed, he said something that stuck with investigators. "I was watching him. Not helping or talking, just watching." Neither of them, or the detective assigned to the case, knew the truth yet. Neither of them understood what had really happened. But the poison did. The wine was the only thing the police could trace back to the poison. No one had seen James drink from it directly, but witnesses recalled him taking a sip, then setting it down. No one had seen anyone approach the drink or the bottle after that, and when the toxicology report came in, it revealed a disturbing fact. The substance that killed James was organophosphate, a chemical used in pesticides and some medical treatments. But it wasn't something that was easy to access, at least not without purpose. It was clear this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment attack. The poison had a delayed onset, meaning it wasn't fast-acting. Whoever administered it knew exactly how it would work. It wasn't random. It was precise. They understood what they were doing, and they were prepared. This was a calculated move, not an outburst. Whoever did this had planned it. They didn't act impulsively. They were methodical. And the poison wasn't something you could pick up easily at a local store. It required access, specialized knowledge. But who had access to something like that? The answer didn't come easily. The detectives were used to cases where motives were clear. But this was different. James had no obvious enemies. There was no trail of bad blood that led to one person. Even the two suspects had a motive, but neither had the chance to administer the poison. Neither had access to the wine in question. As the hours wore on, the detectives hit dead ends. Jenny's story checked out. Daniel's story checked out. And yet, the question nagged at them. Who had poisoned James Blake? Whoever had done it had planned every step. They knew the victim well. They knew what was happening in the background. And they were patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. But that moment hadn't come yet. With the wine bottle clean, and the two main suspects seemingly locked into their alibis, the investigation had no direction. No proof. No one had access to the chemical used in the murder. No one had seen anything. No one had touched the drink. But there was one thing that couldn't be ignored. The bottle had come from Michael Blake. And Michael Blake? Well, he wasn't saying anything. It wasn't until the news of James' death broke weeks later that Linda, Michael's secretary, even began to consider what had really happened that day. By then, she had already moved on from the incident. But after hearing the news, something nagged at her. She kept replaying the words she had overheard. "Put me back in the will, or I'll ruin everything." She thought back to the tension in the office, the anger she had sensed between father and son. It wasn't just about business. It was about control. It was about legacy. And at that moment, Linda realized something. James had known something. He had been close to finding out what had been hidden all along. And he had been ready to expose it. The thought consumed her. She knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. She'd seen the way Michael operated. She'd worked with him for years. And if she was being honest with herself, there had always been something off about him. She had always kept her distance from the personal side of the Blake's life. But after hearing the news report about James, Linda knew she couldn't look the other way anymore. The moment Linda realized the gravity of what she had heard was when the police began reaching out for information. Their investigation into James' death was growing more intense. And with each passing day, the mystery deepened. They were offering a $50,000 reward for anyone with valuable information about what happened to James that night. The tip line was open. And that's when Linda made her decision. She wasn't sure how far this would go, or where it would lead. But she couldn't keep quiet any longer. She called. The conversation with the detective was short, but heavy. She confirmed what she had overheard. The argument. The words James had said to Michael. And she mentioned the strange calmness that had followed. Michael hadn't seemed panicked, hadn't seemed concerned. Just distant. Too distant for a man who had just watched his son walk out of his office in fury, demanding a change to the will. Linda didn't know if her testimony would lead to significant. She wasn't sure if it was enough to crack the case wide open. But she knew it had to be said. Because, as much as she had tried to ignore it, the tension between James and Michael had been real. And in the end, that tension, those words, had been the beginning of the end for James. She hadn't known it then, but her statement would be part of the pieces that made the investigators look at Michael Blake differently. They began to ask more questions. They started looking into the will. They began to see the cracks in the family's perfect image. And they began to wonder, how much was Michael really willing to do to protect his secrets? As the investigation grew, it was becoming clear. James had been caught in the crossfire of a much larger game. And while Linda hadn't been there the night James died, her words would become a turning point. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and they pointed in one direction, straight to the heart of Michael Blake's carefully constructed life. The investigation into James Blake's death had, until now, been plagued by confusion and dead ends. No witnesses, no clear suspect. But everything changed the moment the wine bottle was brought in for testing. The wine wasn't just a gift, it was the key to understanding what had happened to James. The label on the bottle was custom-made, elegant, with a refined design that stood out from any mass-produced bottles on the market. It wasn't just another bottle of wine. It was a meticulously crafted item, the kind of gift that wasn't picked off a shelf. It was personal, and it was just the beginning. Detectives quickly traced the wine back through distribution channels. It wasn't something available in stores. This bottle had come from a boutique supplier in California, a company with no public retail presence, something reserved only for high-end clients. But that didn't raise immediate red flags. Michael Blake, as a business mogul, had relationships that spanned beyond state lines. It made sense that he could have a connection to such a supplier. But the connection didn't end there. The delivery didn't come from California directly. It had been hand-delivered. The lead took an unexpected turn when detectives tracked the package to a local print shop in South Florida, a shop that wasn't far from where Diana Shaw lived. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. Print shops routinely print labels for events and personal orders. But when the detectives looked deeper into the records of this particular print shop, they found a shocking connection. Michael Blake had personally paid for the label. The invoice was traced back to one of his personal credit cards, and the order wasn't a random business expense. It was scheduled specifically for the day James' party took place. Michael's response, when confronted, was matter of fact. The wine, he said, had been a gift sent to him from a business affiliate. It was nothing more than a thoughtful gesture, meant to celebrate James' birthday. He claimed he had no idea it would be involved in his son's death. His explanation, calm and controlled, raised even more suspicion. The gift, the label, the delivery, all of it felt too planned. When detectives dug further, they found that the company Michael named as the source of the wine had no record of sending anything. No email, no phone call, no order in their system. The wine wasn't just a casual gift. It was part of a calculated effort, and it had been orchestrated by Michael himself. The print shop's location, just a stone's throw away from Diana Shaw's home, couldn't be ignored either. But it wasn't just the wine bottle that raised alarms. The investigation led the detectives to Michael's personal digital footprint. Hidden behind a series of purchases, deleted search terms painted a grim picture. How to delay poison effects, organophosphate dosage, poison effects on the human body. Michael had done more than just buy a rare bottle of wine. He had been preparing for something far darker. The searches didn't just suggest a man who had been curious. They suggested calculation, a meticulous plan to murder his own son. The trail didn't stop at the wine. The chemical Michael had purchased was traced to a storage unit in Marcus' name, Diana's oldest son, who had been kept hidden from public view. The delivery of the poison had arrived just days before James' death. The question now wasn't just why it had been delivered to Marcus. The question was why Michael had involved his secret family. The poison, the wine, the printed labels, all of it pointed to a single chilling conclusion. Michael Blake had not only hidden his affair from the world, he had been planning for James' eventual removal for years. The security footage from Blake and partners was conveniently missing. No cameras had captured any key moments that could link Michael to the crime. But there was something the cameras hadn't captured: James' phone logs. They proved he had been at the office the night he died. He had gone to his father's office, likely to confront him, to demand the answers he knew were being kept from him. He didn't know it at the time, but the conversation between father and son would seal his fate. Everything was falling into place. The wine, the poison, the search history, the missing footage, it was all connected. Michael Blake had been careful. He had planned everything. But now, the investigators were closing in. The only question left was who had placed the wine in James' hand that night. It wasn't a random act. It was part of a calculated scheme to take James out of the equation. and Michael had orchestrated it from start to finish. The truth was finally surfacing, but with Michael's deflection, the investigation would soon reveal just how far his manipulation had gone. The investigators had found everything they needed: digital footprints, chemical purchases, phone logs. The only thing left was to confront Michael. The evidence was undeniable, but Michael, as always, stayed composed. He had been prepared for this, but now the game was changing. The final confrontation loomed, and everything Michael had worked to cover up was about to be exposed. The police were still piecing together the final parts of the investigation when they decided it was time to inform Mary Blake. She had been kept in the dark about everything: about Michael's secret life, about the affair with Diana Shaw, and most importantly, about the role her husband had played in her son's death. When Detective Philip and his partner sat down with Mary, they did their best to keep their voices calm, their demeanor gentle. The news wasn't just about the murder. It was about the betrayal of a lifetime. Mary listened to the detective's words, her face pale and strained. She nodded, but there were no words. She didn't ask questions. She didn't scream. She just sat there, taking in the weight of it all. The affair, the children, the poison, the betrayal by the man she had spent decades with. Your husband, Detective Philip said softly, was involved in the death of your son, Mary. He poisoned him. He made sure that James wouldn't survive the night. She said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, as though she were still trying to process what the detective had just said. Her husband had been living a double life, and she had never known. The information didn't hit her all at once. It wasn't a violent outburst. Detective Philip watched her carefully, knowing how important it was to let her process. There was nothing left to say. The truth had been revealed. Michael Blake was the mastermind behind the tragedy, and he would face the consequences. But Mary, she would have to carry this weight alone. That night Mary sat in the dark, unable to sleep. Her world had shifted on its axis, and the grief of it was suffocating. The loss of James was too much. The betrayal of her husband, her closest companion, was even worse. She had lived her life believing in something that was never real. Her entire marriage was a lie, and the devastation from that knowledge crushed her heart. As the night wore on, Mary slipped into a deep sleep, one that would never be disturbed. She passed away in her bed sometime during the night. Her heart simply gave out. The emotional toll had proven too much. At 7:30 a.m. the following morning, Mary Blake was found by her housekeeper. She had died in her sleep. The cause of death was listed as a stroke, a result of the overwhelming stress that had been building within her for years. For the second time in just a few weeks, the Blake family was torn apart. First James, now Mary. 2 lives lost to the same man. 2 generations ruined by the same set of lies. The investigation was no longer just about Michael's betrayal of James. It was about a family that had been shattered at its core. Mary's death was the final straw, the last chapter in a tragic story that had unfolded too quickly to be undone. And for Michael, the consequences were just beginning. The trial of Michael Blake began in January 2025, nearly a year after the shocking death of his son James. It was the beginning of the end for the man who had once been untouchable. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters, business associates, and curious onlookers who all wanted a glimpse at the man who had been the face of Florida's business elite for decades. Michael Blake, the revered CEO, the philanthropist, the pillar of the community, was now the defendant in a murder case that had gripped the state. His defense team came out swinging. They claimed Michael had acted under temporary psychosis, brought on by the stress of his family's peace. His attorneys argued that James had blackmailed him, threatening to expose his affair with Diana Shaw, his second family, and the secret changes to his will. They painted Michael as a man pushed to the brink, a father pushed to the edge by his son's demands and threats. The prosecution, however, was ready. They were armed with a mountain of evidence, financial receipts, the Google searches Michael had made on his personal account, the ones about poisons and organophosphates, the deleted terms that Michael had tried to erase but couldn't completely wipe away. Then there were the tip-line statements from witnesses who had spoken about the tension in the family, the recent confrontations, the long-standing resentment between father and son. But perhaps the most damning evidence was the motive. The prosecution argued that Michael had killed James not out of fear, but out of greed and a need for control. The inheritance, the family name, the business, all of it was at stake. Michael had been preparing for a future where his son had no part in it. The prosecution laid out his actions in painstaking detail, showing how Michael had quietly shifted control of the empire to his second family, how he had planned for a future where James had no place, and how he had used his wealth and influence to secure that future. The defense struggled to keep up. Their claim of psychosis didn't land well with the jury. The financial evidence was clear. Michael had manipulated not just his son, but the very system that had allowed him to live a life of power. He had done it all with precision. There was no temporary psychosis. There was only cold calculation. And then there was Diana Shaw. Despite the mounting evidence, despite the public outrage, she refused to testify. Some said it was because she feared for her children's safety. Others believed it was out of loyalty to Michael, though no one truly understood the depth of their relationship. Whatever the reason, her silence spoke volumes. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned. The verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. Michael Blake, the man who had built an empire, who had led charities and shaped communities, was sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. For Michael, the sentence was the end of everything he had worked for. But for those left behind, life could never go back to normal. By the time Michael's trial ended, the family that once seemed so perfect had been torn apart. The Blake legacy, once so carefully constructed, now lay in ruins. But what did James leave behind? Who was he really? And how would his story be remembered? Jenny, still reeling from everything that had happened, made the decision to leave Florida. She relocated with her children, moving far away from the town that had witnessed so much betrayal. She never remarried. She focused on her children, raising them in peace, away from the chaos that had consumed their lives. The pain of her marriage, of the life she had built with James, never fully left her. But she moved on. She had no choice. Daniel, on the other hand, couldn't escape the shadow of his past, the affair, the lies, the way his best friend had betrayed him in the most personal way imaginable. He divorced Sophia, cutting ties with everyone. Friends, family, anyone who had once been part of his life. Daniel withdrew from the world, choosing isolation over connection. The man who had once been inseparable from James now lived in a self-imposed silence. Diana Shaw disappeared from public life. Once a trusted friend, then a shadow in the family's past, she vanished without a trace. No interviews, no public statements. She left the country, and any attempts to reach her were met with silence. No one knew where she went, or if she was even alive. Her role in the tragedy seemed to vanish with her. Blake and Partners, the company James had fought to inherit, was sold off. It was too tainted by the scandal, too much of a liability. The employees who had once looked up to James as their future CEO were left with nothing. The empire he had built crumbled into pieces. The buyers took over, and the name Blake and Partners was erased from the business world. In the wake of James' death, Florida mourned. The media ran their stories, the public whispered, but only a few knew the full truth. Only a few understood the cost of the legacy. James Blake didn't just die because of his own failings. He died because of what he uncovered. The betrayal of a lifetime, the lies that had been woven into the very fabric of his family. And when everything was exposed, it wasn't just a tragedy for one man. It was a tragedy for everyone who had ever known him. His legacy was one of tragedy. One of secrets exposed, lives destroyed, and a family torn apart by greed and betrayal. And as the dust settled, the question still remained. What happens to a legacy built on lies? What happens when the truth comes crashing down? Not all murders come with a weapon. Some come with a pen, a lie, a legacy. And in the end, James Blake didn't just die because of what he did. He died because of what he uncovered. Story 4. On the 14th of August, 2014, a tip-off came and the police stormed their home, only to find 3 lifeless bodies on the floor. 2 men lay twisted on the ground, their bodies defiled beyond recognition, genitals removed with brutal precision. A helpless, disabled daughter lay lifeless beside them, her eyes wide, as if she had seen too much in the short life she had. But what they didn't know was that the true horror wasn't what they found. It was what they would soon uncover. The room is silent save for the soft shuffle of footsteps as the officers enter, their eyes scanning, taking in the horror before them. The faces of the dead stare at nothing, frozen in time. No screams, no struggle outside. The scene suggests no fight. But the room tells a different story, a scene so chaotic, it feels as if the walls themselves might speak. A broken chair, clothes scattered across the floor. There had been a struggle here, but where was the sound? Why was there nothing but silence? The officers kneel, one checking for signs of life, but it's too late. The faces of the dead are locked in expressions of fear and confusion, their eyes wide, as if pleading for answers they would never get. And then something catches their eye, a symbol smeared in blood, painted on the wall beside the doorframe. Strange, unfamiliar, cryptic. It's as if the killer wanted to leave something behind, a mark, a signature, or perhaps a clue. But what did it mean? The officers exchanged glances, their faces grim. This was no ordinary crime. This wasn't a botched robbery. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was something personal. This was a message. And the moment the officers crossed that threshold, they stepped into a nightmare that had only just begun to unfold. As the officers step back, calling for backup, the camera lingers on the symbol, the room, the bodies, and the unspoken questions that hang in the air. Who were these people? Why were they left like this? And most terrifying of all, who did this and why? This wasn't just a crime. It was a story waiting to be uncovered. The investigation began. The first person was identified. It was Beatrice. Beatrice was a woman who had always longed for a family. Growing up, she was the quiet one, the thoughtful one, often watching other families around her with a sense of longing. Her own family had never been one for grand gestures of affection. Love was spoken in unspoken glances, a touch of the hand, or the occasional nod of understanding. She was the product of a family that valued duty over emotion, where stability was revered, but affection felt almost like a foreign language. As Beatrice grew older, she felt the weight of time pressing on her. Her friends moved on, their lives blossomed with love and children, while she found herself caught in an endless cycle of waiting. She had always dreamed of having a family, a home filled with laughter, a space where she could be herself. But as the years passed, those dreams seemed to drift further away. In a world that often judged women for their single status, Beatrice found herself overwhelmed by the pressure to find someone, anyone, who could give her the life she had always imagined. By her early 30s, Beatrice had begun to doubt whether she would ever have the family she dreamed of. The whispers from family members became more frequent, the concerned glances more pointed. "When will you settle down?" They'd ask. "You can't wait forever." The pressure from the outside world was relentless, but it was nothing compared to the pressure she put on herself. She had always imagined herself as a wife, as a mother, someone who could create a family of her own, full of warmth, love, and belonging. But now she felt like the last one standing in an empty room, unable to find the key that would unlock that dream. Still, Beatrice wasn't one to give up. She put on a brave face, threw herself into her career, and tried to find contentment in the life she had. But every quiet evening spent alone, every family gathering where she was the only one without a partner, chipped away at her sense of peace. Deep down, she felt like something was missing. She couldn't help but wonder if she would ever find the kind of love and security she longed for. Then she met Maxwell. The neighbors confirmed that they both lived in that house. The moment he walked into her life, everything changed. He was charismatic, confident, and full of energy. Beatrice found herself drawn to him immediately, her heart racing with excitement. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone saw her, someone understood her. His attention made her feel like she mattered, like she had finally found her place in the world. In him, she saw the family she had always dreamed of. It felt too good to be true. The man she had been waiting for had finally come along. And for Beatrice, it seemed like the answers to all her questions were suddenly within reach. She could almost hear the sound of doors unlocking, the life she had always wanted finally within grasp. But in those early days, she was too consumed with the excitement to notice the little things, the small, almost imperceptible shifts in the way he looked at her, the way he would challenge her choices, or the way he seemed to hold power over her in a way that didn't feel entirely natural. But for now, all that mattered was the promise of a future that finally seemed attainable. Beatrice, eager to start her life, allowed herself to believe that this was the man who would give her everything she had ever wanted, someone to share her dreams with, someone to build a family with. She had longed for this moment for so long, and now, it felt like she had finally found her place in the world. The years passed, and with them, Beatrice's dreams took shape. She found herself living in a home filled with the promise of family, a space where she could finally plant roots. Yet, as the days turned into months, and the months into years, the nagging feeling that something was off, something she couldn't quite name, began to creep in. For all the love she had hoped for all the warmth she had imagined, Beatrice began to realize that things were not as they seemed. The life she had dreamed of wasn't as perfect as she had hoped, and the questions she had buried for so long started to resurface. But that was still ahead of her. For now, in the home, surrounded by family photos and memories of happier days, Beatrice felt the fleeting taste of what it was like to finally belong. She had what she always wanted, at least, that's what she told herself. Maxwell had a son, John, a boy from his previous relationship, and while Beatrice never expected him to just blend in, she also never imagined how difficult it would be. He was a young, tall kid. She had always imagined raising a family of her own children, growing up together, learning from one another. But his son was a reminder of a life before her, a life she had never been part of. But for now, she kept going, kept pretending that everything was fine. She had what she wanted, didn't she? The house, the family, the man she had dreamed of. What else could she ask for? Beatrice and Maxwell got married on March 15th, 2015. It was a day she had dreamed about for years. A beautiful ceremony filled with hope, a new beginning. As they exchanged vows, Beatrice couldn't help but feel like this was the moment she had been waiting for her whole life. She had the family, the love, the life she had always wanted. The world felt full of promise, and for the first time in a long time, Beatrice felt like she belonged. 9 months later, Beatrice gave birth to Sophia. The moment the doctor placed Sophia in Beatrice's arms, everything changed. Her daughter, a beautiful, fragile child, was born with a disability. Sophia's body was weak, her movements limited, her future uncertain. The doctor's voice was soft, gentle, as they explained the severity of her condition. Beatrice, holding her daughter for the first time, was heartbroken. Her dreams of the perfect family, of the life she had always imagined, suddenly seemed so far away. In that moment, Beatrice could feel her world tilt. She looked at Sophia, her tiny fingers wrapped around her hand, and she wondered. What had gone wrong? Why was this happening? She had waited so long for this family, for the life she had always wanted, and now, it felt like that life was slipping through her fingers. She wanted to fall apart. She wanted to scream, to cry, to question why life had to be so unfair. But as she gazed into Sophia's eyes, she knew she couldn't. She couldn't afford to break down. Not for herself, not for Maxwell, and certainly not for Sophia. Her daughter needed her to be strong, to be the mother she had always dreamed of becoming. She didn't have the luxury of giving in to despair. Instead, Beatrice found herself embracing the weight of the responsibility that came with her daughter's condition. She couldn't allow herself to fall into the darkness. She had to be strong for Sophia, for their future, for the family she had always dreamed of. But the days that followed weren't easy. Beatrice spent countless sleepless nights by Sophia's side, learning how to care for her in ways she never imagined. There were appointments with doctors, therapy sessions, and the constant worry about whether she was doing enough. Every day felt like a battle, a fight against the overwhelming feelings of fear and uncertainty. Yet, Beatrice did it all with grace, with a quiet strength she hadn't known she had within her. She told herself that as long as she had breath in her body, she would never stop fighting for Sophia. In the quiet moments, when the world felt too heavy and the silence pressed in on her, Beatrice would look at her daughter and remind herself of the promise she had made. To never give up, to never let Sophia feel less than loved. As hard as it was, Beatrice knew she had to be the mother Sophia needed. The mother she hadn't had growing up strong, unwavering, and filled with love. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Beatrice began to feel something else creeping in loneliness. Maxwell, while supportive in his own way, seemed distant. There were moments when Beatrice needed him most, when the weight of everything became too much, but he was often absent, physically or emotionally. The life Beatrice had envisioned, a family coming together, growing together, was slipping through her fingers, and she was left alone to carry the weight of it all. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to let the loneliness consume her. She had to keep going for Sophia. The future was uncertain, but one thing Beatrice knew for sure. She would give her daughter everything she had. Sophia was beautiful, fragile, and full of promise, despite the challenges that lay ahead. Beatrice looked at her daughter and saw not the disability, but the potential. She saw a life worth fighting for. And so, she pressed on. She didn't have the answers, she didn't know how to fix everything, but she knew that her would have her love, her strength, and her devotion every step of the way. The journey was just beginning, and Beatrice was ready to face whatever came next. Because she had something far more powerful than fear, her love for her daughter, and the promise she had made to be strong. Identifying the bodies gave the officers clarity, but it did not solve half of the mystery. The police still wanted to know what led to this bloodbath. Then came life testament from the neighbors. The neighbors had always been polite, friendly even, but they didn't truly know what went on behind the walls of Beatrice's home. From the outside, everything appeared to be normal. But there were whispers, subtle shifts that even the neighbors could sense. They were never really happy. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, said quietly, her hands wringing together in her lap as she recalled the years she had spent across the street. She had lived there since Beatrice and Maxwell moved in, watching the family grow from a distance. You could tell something wasn't right. It wasn't always obvious, but if you looked closely enough, you could feel it in the air, like a heaviness, a quiet kind of tension that lingered around them. The days were routine. Maxwell left for work early, wearing his sharp suit, always on time. Beatrice spent her days at home, caring for Sophia, or so it seemed. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place, but it was the small things, the moments when Maxwell would return home that Mrs. Thompson would notice. He never greeted her with a smile, never with the warmth you'd expect in a family. He'd come home, drop his briefcase by the door, and go straight to the kitchen or his office without so much as a word. Mrs. Thompson paused, her eyes glistening as she looked down at her hands. Sometimes I'd see Beatrice standing there in the doorway, waiting for him, looking like she was holding her breath, like she was waiting for something. Maybe for him to notice her, maybe for something. I don't know. Other neighbors had noticed too. They would wave as Beatrice walked down the street with Sophia in her stroller. Beatrice would smile back, but it never quite reached her eyes. She was always so kind, always so sweet. One of the local grocery store clerks, who had known Beatrice for years, remarked, but there was something in her voice, like she was carrying a weight no one could see. The couple seemed to be the epitome of normalcy when they interacted with the outside world, but the cracks in their relationship were becoming harder to ignore. It wasn't just the awkward silences, or the way Beatrice seemed to withdraw more and more into herself. It was the way the neighbors started noticing the subtle shifts in Maxwell's behavior. He would often be seen shouting at Sophia from the driveway, his voice rising in anger for reasons no one could ever quite make out. It was always strange, another neighbor, a middle-aged man named Harold, said. He'd raise his voice at her for the littlest things. Sometimes I'd hear him yelling at Sophia for not doing something right. But Beatrice? She'd just stand there looking down. It was like she was afraid to speak, afraid to interrupt. It was like they were just existing together, but not really living, Mrs. Thompson added, her voice tinged with sadness. They were all there, in the same house, but it never felt like a family. There was no warmth, no laughter, just a lot of silence. The neighbors didn't know the full extent of what was happening behind closed doors. They never saw the private moments, the ones that truly defined the family's struggles. But they felt it. The air always felt thicker when Maxwell came home, like the whole house shifted with his presence. And Beatrice? She was always there, always waiting, but never truly living. She didn't seem happy, Harold said quietly, shaking his head. But she never complained. She never said anything to anyone. She just kept going, like she was stuck in some sort of silent dance, just trying to keep it together. The police still probed for more answers. Things were beginning to fall in place, but the question of a motive lingered. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A video. A confession. Something no one had seen coming. The veil was lifted, and the truth, once hidden beneath layers of lies, was darker than anyone could have imagined. The video surfaced without warning. It was grainy, the footage distorted, but the faces in it were unmistakable. Maxwell and Beatrice. They sat across from each other in the living room, their conversation hushed, but urgent. The camera flickered as the scene unfolded, each word carrying a weight that felt heavier with every passing second. Maxwell's voice broke the silence first, his tone calm but cold. "We can't go on like this, Beatrice. You know what has to be done." Beatrice shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her eyes lowered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She responded quietly, almost hesitantly. "I know, but I can't." Maxwell cut her off, his voice sharper now, the control in his words evident. "You will help me. You've already done it. 10 times. You've seen how they react, how they always go along with it." Beatrice lowered her eyes even further, as if the weight of her actions was too much to face. "I can't keep doing this. We can't keep doing this. It's killing me, Maxwell." Maxwell leaned in closer, his hands slamming down on the table with a force that made her flinch. "It's not about you anymore, Beatrice. It's about them. You will do it again, and you'll keep doing it, just like we planned." Beatrice's face remained unreadable as her body stiffened. She nodded almost imperceptibly, defeated. The conversation ended there, abruptly, as Maxwell rose and walked out of the frame, leaving Beatrice sitting alone in the silence. The investigators had been sifting through endless files, and this video, this single moment of captured horror, was the key. The evidence they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Maxwell's cold control over Beatrice, the abuse, the torment she had been forced to endure, was all laid bare. What had once been a theory was now undeniable. Maxwell had controlled Beatrice in ways no one could have imagined. The manipulation was deep, the cruelty calculated, and then there was the DNA. Forensic tests confirmed Maxwell's involvement in the multiple pregnancies. The DNA matched perfectly. Maxwell's genetic material had been found in samples taken from each of the pregnancies. It was more than a confession. It was irrefutable evidence of his direct role in the horrors Beatrice and Sophia had suffered. It was the damning link the investigators had been waiting for. But the real shock came when the diary was found. A worn, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Beatrice's handwriting. The words inside were chilling. In them, Beatrice detailed everything. The abuse, the fear, the confusion, her guilt, and her silent suffering. Page after page she wrote of Maxwell's cruelty. How it had escalated over time. How she had tried to block it out. How she had hoped it would stop. But nothing stopped. She wrote about the moment Maxwell's abuse of Sophia began. It started 2 years ago, just after her 15th birthday, when her daughter's pain became unbearable to witness, yet she couldn't stop it. Beatrice detailed how she had been forced to assist in 10 abortions for her daughter, each one a brutal reminder of her own helplessness. Beatrice had watched as her daughter, the girl she swore to protect, was slowly destroyed by the very man she had once loved. She wrote about how everything led to her disabled daughter having a torn vagina. But then, the darkest entry came. Beatrice had caught John, Maxwell's son, in the act. He was older than her, distant, a shadow in the house. But when Beatrice walked in on him abusing Sophia, the world shattered. The realization hit her with full force. She had been living in a nightmare far darker than she had ever realized. It wasn't just Maxwell, it was both of them. The diary revealed something even more disturbing. A plan. Beatrice had made a decision. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't let Sophia suffer any longer. In the diary, she described how she would drug Maxwell and his son one afternoon. She wrote that she would sedate them, cut off their private parts, and end their reign of terror. And then, in one final act, she would end it all. She and Sophia would die together, ending the nightmare once and for all. The final words of her diary were heartbreaking. She saw this as the only way to stop the madness. For Beatrice, this was the only escape, the only way to protect her daughter from the monsters who had stolen their lives. The investigators, staring at the words on the page, could hardly process what they were seeing. The truth was darker than they could have imagined. Beatrice had been pushed to the edge, cornered by the very people she should have been able to trust the most. The abuse, the control, the manipulation, it was all there, spelled out in her own words. This was no ordinary case. It was a tragedy, a mother's despair, a woman who had been broken beyond repair, who had seen no other way out. The questions that had lingered, questions about who was responsible, what had truly happened behind closed doors, were now answered. The story was clear, and it was impossible to ignore the depth of the pain that had driven Beatrice to such an unimaginable place. With this new discovery, the story was over. Was justice truly served? Could this tragedy have been prevented? What does it say about our blind spots in recognizing abuse, manipulation, and desperation? Beatrice's story, while tragic, is not an isolated one. It's a story that unfolds in the shadows, hidden behind closed doors, where the true nature of the suffering is invisible to the outside world. The horrors that transpired within this home were not just about the actions of one man or one family. They were about a system of silence, of isolation, of unseen pain. What does this case say about the pressures of family expectations? The expectations placed on Beatrice, by her family, by society, by herself, were overwhelming. She was expected to maintain a perfect home, to be a perfect wife and mother, despite the mounting weight of a relationship that was slowly crushing her.
As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.